So in today's episode of The Bureau of Konstantin Volkov, my guest is Adi Schwartz, an Israeli journalist and academic with a distinguished career and a deep record of professional achievement. To my knowledge, he is Israeli correspondent for Monocle and has also worked for Haaretz, right?
Yes, I worked for Haaretz many years ago, and I was also, about a decade ago, worked for Monocle. Mm-hmm. But today I'm more into research. I've done my PhD, and now I'm also a research fellow at the Misgav Institute, and a few other hats that I have.
Okay. Let's start first with a little bit of media explanation, because I think it's important and it is relevant. You've seen Israeli media from the inside. I mean, from Haaretz newsroom to the broader press landscape. For an outsider, Israeli journalism can seem like a battlefield of headlines, ideologies, and political undercurrents. Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post, for instance, for example, often appear to be speaking to entirely different Israelis. Could you walk us through how these media worlds coexist now, especially when you are not so deep into them, and perhaps where Prime Minister Netanyahu fits into this media map?
So among the English-speaking media outlets in Israel, I would say that closer to the center is Jerusalem Post, perhaps center-right with a little bit tilt for the right. I would say that Haaretz is extreme left. It represents the view, as a former Haaretz employee, I can say that the views and the position that Haaretz takes is perhaps maximum 5% of the Israeli society. Mm-hmm. So I know that Haaretz has a lot of reputation outside of Israel, and perhaps many diplomats and perhaps many journalists outside of Israel rely heavily on Haaretz. Unfortunately, I can say that many of their reportings is very, very politically biased. Okay, they have their own opinions, but they represent a very tiny, segment of Israeli society. Benjamin Netanyahu is head of the center-right or right party, Likud. So of course he's much closer to Jerusalem Post. He's a rightist. Likud is a right wing party. Of course, I'm not getting into the Hebrew speaking media outlets because I assume they're less relevant.
When you were at Haaretz, how did editorial meetings actually work? Was there a clear line between reporting and opinion, or did political leanings that you talked about inevitably shape the day-to-day journalism decisions?
So a few things. First of all, you're taking me a little bit into the crisis of journalism as well. But I will tell you a few things. First of all, I think that Haaretz became much more radical in the last 10 or 15 years. I worked there in the beginning of this century. So I left there 15 years ago, and I can tell you I worked there a decade beforehand. And back then, it wasn't that radical. It was leftist, of course. Haaretz was also always a leftist newspaper, but it was more moderate. So I think that the paper itself became more radical. I think that part of the problem is the economic crisis of the journalism, which means that you have to be, you need the clickbaits, right? You need to be, the headlines to be more extreme. You need to be, your criticism must be not modest or, in between, but it has to be, you have to shout what you want. So you're not only critical of Israel, but Israel is committing genocide and like stuff like that. And everything is a war crime. And like 20 years ago, you would write a sentence. Now you make it in a bold with red, etc. But again, these are problems of the journalism. Listen, at the one point, people who work for Haaretz have a leftist point of view. It's normal that people who are working for newspapers with a right-wing view, then it's different. I can tell you that when I was there was little intervention. I didn't feel pressure to write different things. I must admit that my opinion has changed from those days as well. Opinions evolve. I think that reality changed in the Middle East. I think that so many attempts by Israel to offer the Palestinians a state, if you go back to Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, all of this was rejected. Instead of that, we received buses exploding, etc., etc. So, as a human being, as a citizen of Israel, my views have also changed. So it's a complex process, but
yes. So one thing from what we are seeing through media eyes, Israeli society is famously diverse. How diverse it is actually now, exactly?
It's a very good question, because it is true. It is true. The Israeli society is very, very heterogeneous. And you have to take into account, first of all, that we have something like 10 million people. But that if you go 1, 2, 3 generations back, you have Jews who came here. Perhaps Bulgaria is one of the countries where Jews came from, but we have Jews coming from Hungary, from Romania, from Iraq, from Libya, from Russia, from France, from all over the world. Only 50 or 60 years ago, people spoke here so many languages, and they have different, food and different habits and different clothing. So it's true that as time passes, we're already second, third generation, then there are less and less differences. So on the one hand, you can talk about a more coherent society, but I'll give you another example. Society is very much fragmented in relations to religion. You have a segment of the society which is ultra-Orthodox, which means that they preserve Jewish tradition very, very strictly. And then you have on the other side of the spectrum Jews who are very secular, so to speak. So they don't go to synagogues and they don't keep all the traditions. And then you have Arabs and you have Christians and you have Muslims and you have Jews. So yes, it is true. It is a very diverse, very heterogeneous society. But I must tell you that I think that certainly in the last 2 years, since October 7th, and this is something that I think that you don't see in the media, I think actually that the Israeli society has been extremely resilient, has shown, that even if you have sometimes differences of opinion, but at the end of the day, that you're a nation, that you're a nation in trouble, in a sense that you're being attacked. We've been attacked by the Houthis from Yemen, by the Iranians, by Hezbollah. So, it's incredible. We're a very small state, and we were attacked by 7 fronts. And so there's something like a family. On the one hand, family members like to fight between themselves, but they remember that they're a family. So I think it's a little bit true. So yes, it is diverse, but at the end of the day, I think that people understand that they have to stand together and they have to fight together and win together.
You use the word resilience. Isn't it true that there are warning signs about a weakening of Israeli resilience if hostages remain captive indefinitely? From your point, how does prolonged uncertainty erode the bonds that tie Israeli society together that you mentioned?
So listen, I think that my opinion is somewhat controversial in this sense. It's not very politically correct. I wrote it on the first week of the war, and whenever I'm asked, I repeat it again and again. I think that the national security of the state of Israel and the well-being and the lives of 10 million Israelis, right? This is the number of the Israeli citizens, are more important than the lives of 250. Remember, we had 250 in the beginning of the war. Now we have 50, of whom only 20 are supposedly alive. Now it's a tragedy. It's a human tragedy. And of course, I'm not angry at the families. I'm very sympathetic, etc., etc. But you know that most of the countries in the world do not negotiate with terrorists when they have hostages. The American administration, American governments, for years and for decades, they don't negotiate with hostage takers. I think there are other countries in the world. Yes, it's a tragedy, but by negotiating with terrorists, you encourage them to kidnap more and more Israelis. I think it's a mistake. I think it's a strategic mistake. I think it's one of the assets of Hamas. They were very clever in this sense. And they have been able to, imagine there weren't currently hostages in Gaza. I imagine that the military effort would be much easier. Mm-hmm. And, the war could have ended long ago. Yes, I think it's
I understand.
Yeah, I think sorry.
But
go on.
Netanyahu presents the Gaza City takeover as a decisive move to defeat Hamas and secure Israel. From your perspective, is this more a military necessity then, or a political statement?
Of course it's a military necessity. I mean, Hamas has committed the worst atrocity and the worst violence against Jews and against Israelis since the Holocaust. In my opinion, in itself, that is enough for them to not exist anymore. I cannot imagine a reality in which the state of Israel continues to live side by side next to these people. So in my view, the challenge, or what we have to do is exactly the same as in World War II. The Nazi regime, you cannot finish World War II and say, okay, now Hitler and the Nazis remain only in Germany or only in Berlin. No, you have to finish them. Some things that people do have consequences, and I think that this is the case that Israel, in the military perspective, and by the way, also from psychological perspective, I mean, can you imagine that these people kidnapped and murdered and raped and did everything they did, and okay, they had these 20 months that the IDF attacked them, and then everything goes back to normal and they survive? No, I don't think that this is acceptable. I think that these people should be taken out, and I certainly believe that this is a military necessity.
Okay, these people, you said, you wrote on X that the framing of the war in Gaza is wrong. It is against, you wrote, the Palestinians and their ideology, with Hamas currently serving as their armed force. Can you explain this to me?
Yes, of course. It's a very important question. And I think that this framing or the understanding of the conflict is actually the most important thing that we have to know. Because for some reason, the image that perhaps also in Israel, but certainly in the West or in Europe or around the world, is that, everybody agrees Hamas are the bad guys. I mean, perhaps, Iran and Qatar don't agree, or Turkey. But I think that most people saw what happened on 7th of October. They agree that these were atrocities, etc., etc. So they somehow think that, okay, there's Hamas, and there's some kind of a separation between them and, these peaceful, peace-loving population, which are the Palestinians, and somehow, Hamas is taking advantage of the population, etc., etc., etc. I believe that you know this as well as me. But this is not true. I mean, Hamas did not conquer the Gaza Strip or came. It's not an African militia or a gang that came from the moon. All the members of Hamas were born in the Gaza Strip. They were elected in elections. It's true that it was 20 years ago, but if you look at all the opinion polls, and even in the West Bank, right, which is supposedly, it's not controlled by Hamas, you see tremendous support for Hamas, even after 7th of October. So what does it mean? It means that Palestinians After 7th of October, when they are asked, do you support Hamas? So this is the same Hamas who kidnapped, murdered, and raped Jews. They say, yes, absolutely so. So what I'm trying to say is that, unfortunately, Hamas is the representative, among other factions, of course, but Hamas is a representative of the Palestinians. I can remember that when the American President Joe Biden, a few days after October 7th, came to Israel and, showed a lot of support, and it was very warm, and it was very pleasant, of course, as an Israeli to see that an American president, came to Israel, and et cetera, et cetera. But this is exactly what he said. He said, Hamas does not represent the Palestinians. And, I wish it were true. I wish it were true. I would be very happy to know that only a small, segment of the Palestinian society has so violent feelings towards the Jews, but this is not true. And for over 100 years, and there are differences between Hamas and the PA who governs the West Bank. There are differences, for example, in their relations to religion. Hamas is a more religious faction. The PA in the West Bank is more secular in the sense that, for example, how they treat women and how they have to go with covering their head. Okay, so they have differences of how they think about drinking alcohol. They have all kinds of differences in how they think that society should be governed. But in the question of the relationship with the Jews, and can a Jewish state remain and exist in the Middle East, unfortunately, the Palestinian society is against this notion. This is the root cause of the conflict. So 7th of October was very brutal, was very violent, but it's not, extraordinary. It's part and parcel of the entire Palestinian ideology for the last 100 years. We do not accept the fact that the Jewish state exists, and we will fight and we'll do everything we can against its existence. Now, I want to say here something more because I think that for many people around the world, Israel seems like a strong country, we're one of the countries with, in the 20 or 30 countries. If you look at the GDP and, people say that we have nuclear weapons, et cetera, high tech. And so people look at us and outside of the Middle East and don't think that our existence is in question. But in this region, amongst our neighbors do not accept us still. They still believe that if they will be strong enough and resilient enough, they would be able to destroy the state of Israel. That a Jewish state is just a phase, like the Crusaders were here for 100 years, and then the Muslims were able to kick them out. Then yes, again, a Jewish state, okay, we're 77 years old from 1948, but that's not the final world. If the Palestinians will be strong enough, resilient enough, and will not succumb, then they will succeed. So I think that this is the context of 7th of October, and this is what I meant in that tweet.
Okay, so one thing about the Netanyahu's plan, the fact that IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir opposed the plan is significant, especially when we remember that he replaced Halevi just a few months ago. So how unusual is such open disagreement at this level? And what might it signal about internal debates within Israel's security establishment?
Yes, again, it's a very good question. And I will say a few things. First of all, we have to take into account that there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation, and we don't entirely know what's happening behind closed doors. Sometimes there are reports, and the next day they are being refuted, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not in a position to tell you exactly what's going on. It seems indeed that there were differences of opinion regarding the question of how to achieve the goal. So to the best of my knowledge, currently, still the head of the General Chief of Staff and the government, still all of them say that they want to achieve all the goals that were set in the beginning of the war. meaning destroying military capability of Hamas, destroying civilian capabilities like their ability to rule over the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, creating the conditions to free the hostages, and making sure that Gaza will not be anymore a threat to Israel. Now, there are questions, for example, of should the IDF actually conquer the Gaza Strip, or perhaps put a siege around the Gaza city. This is what the Zamir suggested. Mm-hmm. I think on one hand, it's normal. It's good to have disagreements. It's not a good sign when everybody says yes to something. We're dealing with, Israeli soldiers who are supposed to enter this area and be in danger. So, of course, it's good to have, robust discussions. Again, I don't know exactly what's going on behind closed doors. I can only share with you my hope mm-hmm. that, eventually a good result will come out of this.
So finally, if Israel maintains a permanent foothold in Gaza City, what scenarios do you personally see unfolding politically, diplomatically, and socially over the next few months?
So, listen, I can tell you what I would like to see.
Okay.
I certainly don't think that there would be a permanent Israeli presence in the Gaza Strip. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think anyone wants it. The Prime Minister had said so himself. I don't think that this is on the table. I think that the right way, by the way, 2 years ago, not now, right after October 7th, was to actually put a siege on the Gaza Strip while letting all unarmed civilians leave the area. So, of course, we don't consider babies and women and unarmed men as targets of war. So they could leave the area, and then everybody who stays, whether it's Gaza City or whatever, they are considered to be enemy. This is, by the way, exactly what the Americans do, what the British does, what the British Army is doing. It appears in their manual. This is the way how to, if you want to make them surrender, this is the way. The more important part is what happens afterwards. And this is exactly what happened with Germany and Japan. Well, the first thing was to surrender, but then you have to create the conditions for the Palestinians to understand that they have to put an end to the war. It means to change completely their education system, to make sure that they don't teach their children to hate Jews or to kill Jews. It means, we haven't gotten into this in this interview, but it means that there should be no more Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip from the war of 1948. Can you imagine? They still consider themselves to be refugees from a war 77 years ago. There's no precedent for that in Europe, not in Asia, not in Africa. All of that was in a specific, project, a political project to take all the resources of the Palestinians for the war against Israel. What I'm trying to say is that if we don't do this, then all the reconstruction effort would be in vain. This is what happened again and again and again. There was a war. Afterwards, the Palestinians received billions of dollars from the Americans, from the Europeans, from the Qataris, from the Iranians. And look what they did with it. They built tunnels, they built rockets, and they built ammunition to fight the Jews. What I'm saying is that if we want to change this course, we have to change their ideology. As long as their motivation is to free Palestine from the river to the sea, right? That slogan that we hear in American campuses and in the streets of London. As long as this is their motivation, then this is what they will do with the cement and the money and all the reconstruction efforts. What I'm saying is, after the surrender of Hamas, before starting any kind of reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, the Palestinians must be put under the obligation to stop the 100 years war against the Jewish state.
Today's conversation with Adi Schwartz reminds us how complex, nuanced, and human the stories behind the headlines really are. Thank you so much, Adi, for joining us and for you for listening to the Bureau of Konstantin Volkov. See you in the next episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.